In this section on the chapter on the immune system, we're going to consider the pathogens that we fight off. In this splash picture, I just want to point out this is a colorized scanning electron micrograph, but the green elements in this represent a type of bacterium, a spherical shaped bacterium. In talking about the immune system, especially considering the pathogens, we're going to tend to use sort of military or police metaphors. The pathogens are enemies. We talk about invaders, foreign invaders from outside the body. We talk about patrols and sentries and alerting the rest of the system to things. So just keep in mind that we're going to do that. In talking about pathogens, let's look at what that word means. It's actually a construction of words that we're going to see quite a few of in this section. Pathos is the Greek word for disease or suffering. And gen means to be born, as in the word generate. And this type of construction, which we'll see several of, is getting at what is being generated. So pathogens generate disease. Allergens generate an allergy. Antigens generate an antibody response. Carcinogens generate cancer. Pyrogens generate heat in the form of fever or something like that. To learn about what the immune system is working against, we want to consider a few different types of pathogens. But before we look at them specifically, let's consider a way that biology classifies living things, as some of these pathogens fall into these groups. Biologists classify living things into different groups. Two of the three main living groups are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We won't consider the third group here exactly because they fit into the prokaryote group as much as matters for this course. The commonality between these two words, I hope you can see, is karyo as the root, which means nucleus, based on a Greek word. Prokaryotes are organisms that existed before the nucleus came to be part of the structure of living things. And then eukaryotes are those organisms that have a true nucleus. The point I want to make here is that prokaryotes, which is essentially bacteria, are structurally fairly simple. There are three types as far as what shape the organisms have. There are rod-shaped, spherical, and spiral-shaped bacteria, but they're functionally very diverse. And prokaryotes include a group of organisms called extremophiles, which are really more of the other type of living classification that I'm not including here. But they live in places where we couldn't even imagine life existing. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, are structurally very diverse. We see eukaryotes making up all the different groups that we're familiar with for most living organisms: animals, plants, fungi, and the group that was at one time collectively called protists, but lately has been broken up into subgroups that we won't go into here. They can be single or multicellular organisms. It's just that the cells themselves tend to be functionally fairly simple, very dedicated to particular tasks, and not as diverse as we see in prokaryotes. This is a photomicrograph of rod-shaped bacteria, probably the more common types of pathogens that we're going to see. And the scale bar here gives you a sense of their size relative to the size of cells in our body. The scale bar is 1 micrometer across, which would suggest one of these is maybe 250 nanometers in diameter, and the one right above the scale bar is probably about 2 micrometers in length. A single red blood cell, one of the smaller types of cells in our body, would probably cover this entire field of view at a diameter of about 8 micrometers. So these are very small organisms that we're talking about here. This micrograph shows us an example of virus particles. These are not living organisms. They don't satisfy one of the base requirements of being alive, which is to reproduce on their own. And because of that, viruses are an insidious type of infection. They are using host cells, if they're infecting our body, to make new virus particles. And in doing that, they destroy the cells that they infect at the expense of making new virus particles. Now, there's not a scale bar in this picture, but one of these virus particles is probably about 80 nanometers in diameter, which would suggest that one of the bacteria in the previous micrograph would probably cover most of this field of view. So again, just showing you a sense of scale of these organisms. This micrograph comes from a website that's no longer available, but it was part of the Army Medical Corps, and it showed micrographs of organisms that were isolated from urinalysis. This is a fungus, probably a yeast infection or something to that effect, and it demonstrates the sort of plant-like nature of fungal cells. It kind of looks like a branching pattern in a plant. But then also they have sort of an animal nature in that they have to infect something and cause some sorts of problems. You wouldn't see an infectious plant. Plants can make toxic molecules, but they themselves don't cause infection. Though they can sometimes resemble plants, fungi are infectious or can be infectious, and therefore a different type of organism altogether. This micrograph shows an organism of the genus Giardia, which causes intestinal discomfort. And I'm just using it here to set up the idea of parasites, which are eukaryotic organisms that cause infection. And they're going to live in our body because they want to be in that environment, that pH, that temperature, with the environment that we provide for them. And they can cause disease because they will basically use us as a food source or something like that. As another example of a single-celled organism that causes infection, this is the amoeba. Now we can see very clearly in this micrograph that this is a eukaryote. We can see a nucleus right smack dab in the middle of it, and the texture that we see in the cytoplasm suggests other types of major organelles. The way that amoeba move is they extend their cell membrane out in what are called pseudopods, and they move toward sources of signals that attract them and move away from signals that repel them. It's very similar to the way that certain white blood cells move, and we'll look at how that works later on. This is a micrograph of a multicellular organism that causes parasitic infection. This is a worm, probably a roundworm type, and we can see the different types of tissue that make it up. There's an epidermis, not the same type of epidermis that we would have, but an outer skin, and we can see very clearly the smooth muscle of its digestive tract. And some of the dark spots might be bits of nervous tissue, some ganglia that we can see. This is a micrograph of another parasitic worm called a hookworm. I'm providing it here with a link at the bottom of the image to a radio podcast that tells a story of hookworms, both how they were eradicated thanks to the Rockefeller Commission, and a more modern story of a relationship that we have with parasitic worms that might be very important in how our immune system works. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. So viruses are not considered living organisms, and because of that, they invade our body and use body cells as hosts to make new viral particles.